We're starting a new study again, as we often do. We finished Ezekiel last time, and now we're moving on to a topical study. Instead of looking at a particular chapter or a set of chapters, we're going to look at an idea, a topic. And the topic is the Shmita that comes up this year, 2021. And also that's tied in with Yom Teruah and all the other feast days. And it's tied into a bunch of other things that we're going to be exploring here too. It's going to be looking at debt and what God says about money. We're going to look about a verse that we looked at last week in the Ezekiel study. Those verses about the virgins and their oil, we're going to look at that and pull something more out of those verses. So we're going to be jumping all over the place here with this, but it's all in that same theme of the Shemitah and the fall feasts, that area of topic. And so starting with the Shemitah, I've mentioned it before, so I think you're probably all pretty aware of it. The Shemitah is a 7-year cycle. It begins on a particular Yom Teruah, and it's beginning this year on September 7th. And so this is the end of one Shemitah and the beginning of another Shemitah, and the Shemitah is that 7-year period. And so this 7-year period is similar to the weekly cycle. In fact, the Bible treats it, the years of the 7 year as days in sometimes. In prophecy, it talks about those things, those 7 years being weeks sometimes or days sometimes. And there's a lot of similarities that you're going to see as we go through this between this cycle and the weekly, daily cycle that we go through. And this Shemitah contains a Sabbath. It's a Sabbath year, which is sometimes, as I said, referred to as a day. And this particular Sabbath is a rest for the land, and it's different that way. So the Shemitah has a rest, just like the weekly Sabbath has a day of rest. The Shemitah has a year of rest, and that year of rest is for the land, not for people. And it also has something that's different from the weekly Sabbath. And we're going to see this also. We're going to talk about the Jubilee a little bit. And both of them have something in common there, is that they have resets that happen at the beginning of those cycles. So with the Shemitah, there's a reset. Debts are all forgiven. People who owed money are all freed. And there's another one that isn't necessarily directly tied to the Shemitah, but it's on the same 7-year cycle. Or it's on a 7-year cycle anyway, and that is freedom for slaves. And both of those are tied together. We're going to see that how that works together. And so this 7-year cycle has the similar rest, except it's a rest for a year, and it's a rest for the land instead of a rest for people. But it has those resets that are a little bit different, and we spend quite a bit of time on those resets and what that means, what we can learn from that. And so those resets, these are the verses that back that up. This comes from Deuteronomy 15. For the first one, it talks about the cancellation of debts. So at the end of every 7 years, you must cancel debts. This is how it is to be done. Every creditor shall cancel any loan that they have made to a fellow Israelite. They shall not require payment from anyone among their own people, because the Lord's time for canceling debts has been proclaimed. You may require payment from a foreigner, but you must cancel any debt your fellow Israelite owes to you. And so that one is specifically the Shemitah. That happens at the very beginning. The Yom Teruah that begins the Shemitah is when that happens. And the second verse that I picked out here from Deuteronomy 15:12 talks about the other part of it, and that's the release from slavery. So if any of your people, Hebrew men or women, sell themselves to you and serve you 6 years, in the 7th year you must let them go free. Now, as I said, that one doesn't specifically say it's going to have to line up with the Shemitah, but most people kind of take it that way and understand it that way. And you'll see how those two are linked together. Freedom from debt and freedom from slavery are definitely linked. And here we'll talk about that. Proverbs is kind of a key verse to that. It says, the rich rule over the poor, and the borrower is slave to the lender. So what we see right there is debt and slave freedom of the Shemitah gives the indebted and slaves, which are in a sense the same thing. That's what this verse is saying. If you are a borrower, you are a slave to the person who has lent you money. And so both of those get freedom on this 7-year cycle. And so it gives them a chance to start again. You don't get trapped in slavery. You don't get trapped in debt. Both of those have that possibility. We know that here, that if you make a really bad business decision, you can be stuck in debt for possibly the rest of your life. And so that is what is being avoided here. And we'll talk more about that too as we go along. And so this chance to escape slavery is what the Shemitah offers, both those kinds of slavery. Now, I mentioned that the Shemitah has a rest, and the verses for that are here. It says, "For 6 years you are to sow your fields and harvest the crops, but during the seventh year let the land lie unplowed and unused. Then the poor among your people may get food from it, and the wild animals may eat what is left. Do the same with your vineyard and your olive grove." So what was to happen there when in the year that the Shemitah changed, the first year of that new Shemitah, you were to just let your crops grow naturally. You weren't to plow the crops, harvest crops. You weren't to do anything to help them grow. You were just to let the land lie fallow and just sit there. And that's something that farmers do nowadays as well. They've realized that if you overexert the land growing stuff, it needs a break. And if you don't give it that break, it'll stop producing. And so that's a lesson that applies through all time, that God had encoded into that. But there's more to this idea. In this case, this was a real act of faith. And we'll talk about the faith aspects of the Shemitah in just a moment here. And so if you don't grow crops and you don't harvest crops, then what do you live on? Well, you expect God to provide, and God said that he would provide. He said that in the year before the Shemitah, if you were going to keep the Shemitah, he would provide extra so that you would have enough. And so that verse comes from Exodus 23, and the very next part of that is verse 12, and it says, 6 days do your work, but on the seventh day do not work, so that your ox and your donkey may rest, and so that the slave born in your household and the foreigner living among you may be refreshed. So what is happening here is Exodus talks about that 6 years of the Shemitah, and then it immediately goes into the 6 days of this. And you can see that parallel. It says for 6 years, and then in the other verse it says for 6 days. And so there's this pattern between these two verses, or two sets of verses. And it says, but during the seventh year, and here it says, but on the seventh day. And it says, then the poor, and then so that your ox and donkey. And so it draws this parallel between them. And so what it's saying is these two are similar. Look at them. They work the same way, although one is based on days, one is based on years. And so the Bible does that many times. You'll see strange occurrences of verses together that you'd say, well, these really aren't on the same topic, but they're actually making a similar, deeper point that God wants you to dig into and see. So that's the case here, is that Shemitah has this rest built into it. It's a year rest for the land. And God is saying it's very similar to the 6-day Sabbath that you keep, where you get your rest. And now we'll mention the Jubilee a little bit. The Jubilee is another 7 cycle, but this one is a 7 Shemitah cycle. So there are 7 sevens in this, so it's 49 years long. It begins also on a Yom Teruah, but no one knows when it starts. What happened in history is they lost track of that, and no one knows when a Jubilee cycle begins anymore. All we know is that it's synchronized with the Shemitah cycle, so when a Shemitah is starting, it might be the start of a Jubilee, but you don't know. You have a chance of 1 in 7 that it would be. And it's kind of sad that that's lost. More about that later. So this Jubilee cycle is also similar to the weekly cycle and to the Shemitah cycle. It contains a Sabbath year, which is sometimes called a day, and it's another rest for the land. And so this makes 2 years in total. So on a Jubilee, what would happen is that, okay, well, let's go back to the Shemitah. For the Shemitah, there would be 1 year where you didn't grow any crops, and you relied on God to provide for you. And what would happen in a Jubilee year is there would be that year from the Shemitah, and then another year, a second year from the Jubilee. So you really exercised faith by expecting that God was going to provide for you for 2 years, and you weren't going to be growing anything yourself. And so it has that Sabbath in it as well that we saw in both the weekly cycle and in the Shemitah cycle. And it also has a reset like we saw in the Shemitah. This one is a different reset again. This one is a land freedom. So what would happen at the beginning of a Jubilee cycle is that any land that you had bought from somebody else would go back to whomever you bought it. And so people could never lose their land permanently. So again, you see that restoration that happens with all these Sabbaths, these rests and resets, so that people can get back from mistakes that they might have made or bad decisions they made, whatever, things can get back to where they were. And people can get a chance to start again. And so I was talking about the Sabbath as acts of faith before, and I'm going to focus on that here. And I've mentioned many times before that the weekly Sabbath is an act of faith, but it's such a small act of faith to trust God to take care of you for one day out of a week. And who can't do that? Well, it isn't that hard to do that. Um, if all else failed, you could be on a diet, but that's not what God wants, of course. But the weekly Sabbath is a day when you trust God to take care of everything in your life, and it makes more sense if you're a farmer, and if your crop is golden and it's ready to be harvested, and here comes a Sabbath, you want to be out in the field, you want to be out harvesting your crop, just in case it rains and destroys your crop. So the Sabbath for a farmer is much more of a faith exercise, because if he knows that if he doesn't go and get his crop, he could lose it. And so for them, we can see that faith aspect. But for us as city people, we don't really experience that faith much. Um, the Shemitah also has that same faith aspect to it, but in a different way. You trust God to take care of you when you forgive a loan. If somebody owed you money and you forgive that, you have to say, well, where am I going to make up that money? I had plans for that, the money that was owed to me. I was going to do things with that, and now I'm not going to have that money. And so there's that aspect of it. It also is trusting God to feed you when you aren't planting crops. And I talked about that whole year where you don't plant crops and you don't harvest crops, and people just go wherever they go, and they pluck up grasses or grains or fruits or whatever grows naturally. That's what people feed themselves on. And God said that He would prepare the people. He would give you bountiful crops in the year before the Shemitah year, but you still had to trust God to do that. And so it was a faith exercise to believe that God would take care of you and that you would be all right. And we can see that one. That one is definitely a year of not planning, not preparing for things, allowing God to take care of everything in your life. That would be a difficult act of faith. And it really was for Israel. We'll talk about that. And it's also trusting God to take care of you when you give up your slaves. That was another thing. Your slaves are like your employees, like your staff. And so what happens if all of a sudden you don't have a lot of your staff because you've let them all go? Well, your whole operations are going to get mixed up. And that's kind of what we see in our society right at this time here, is that a lot of employees have left and businesses are short and they're experiencing all kinds of trouble. They can't do the same level of business that they did before. We went to a restaurant last night that we've never normally had to wait at, and this time we had to wait for 25 minutes for our meals to come out because they just didn't have the staff to do things. And in the same way, any business that loses its staff or employees is an operation that's in trouble. It's struggling. And so it's again another act of faith, is trusting that God is going to take care of all of this. So in the Shemitah, we see there's a lot of very large faith acts there that are involved in that, and trusting God that He's going to make everything okay. And the Jubilee was similar in that way. If you give up the land that you bought, well, now you don't have the same amount of land that you had to grow crops on or do whatever you were doing. Maybe you're growing grapes, whatever it was that land was producing, and you were using it for. Now you don't have that. You don't have the income from that, and it goes back to the owner. And so if you want to get it back again, you're going to have to pay for it again. And so that's obviously another concern for faith, is that you've given up something that you had, and you're going to be without that, and you need to deal with that. So we see those acts of faith in really big steps in both the Shemitah and the Jubilee, and we don't see them in the weekly Sabbath as much. So, but Sabbath and preparation are also a big thing. And the weekly Sabbath is our opportunity to prepare. God said, if you remember, on the very first time that He set up the Sabbath observances in Exodus for the people who were coming out of captivity, He gave them a preparation day. He gave them a day on which He would give them twice as much manna. And they were to prepare that manna, and that manna would last for 2 days, where normally it would only last for one day. And so that day came to be known as Preparation Day. The day before the Sabbath was when you would make all of your preparations, and you would do that so that you could rest on the Sabbath. And so they would prepare the meals and do all of those sorts of things. I suppose they would clean houses or whatever else they needed to do, and so that they would be able to rest on the Sabbath. And that's the way it should be for us too. The day before the Sabbath is the day when you prepare everything so that you can rest on the Sabbath day. And again, that's kind of a small thing because the Sabbath is only one day long. It's not really a struggle. But for the other ones, it was a bigger thing. For the Shemitah, God had said that he was going to provide, as I said before, a bountiful crop of everything the year before the Shemitah year, if they were going to observe the Shemitah. We'll get into that later. And he said, don't worry, I'll give you big crops and everything will be fine. Trust me, you can do that. That'll be fine with you. And so they were to prepare for this. They would get these bountiful crops, and they needed to prepare the crops to keep them for an extra year when they wouldn't be getting a crop. So the preparation is a strong aspect in that too. They were to prepare themselves so that the land could take that rest that God wanted to then, and also prepare themselves for the release of the debtors and slaves. That would take some preparation as well, so that they didn't suffer too big a shock in their business lives. And in the same way as the Shemitah, there's a preparation aspect to that too, because the land was going to be lying fallow for 2 years in a row now. God said that he would give a really, really big bountiful crop in the year before all of that, if they were going to keep the Jubilee. And they would take all of that crop and put it away and store it and do whatever preparation they needed to do that so that it would last them for the 2 years. And the land would be able to rest for those 2 years. So in all of these Sabbaths, we've seen both faith and preparation as key values that God wanted to instill in people through Sabbath keeping. And we'll talk about this some more as we go along here. But there was a problem in keeping these Sabbaths. The Jews tracked the weekly Sabbaths throughout history, and they kept them. They were very good at that, and so we know that the day that we call the Sabbath now is indeed the same day that God said. And they also tracked the dates of the Shemitah through history. However, they never kept those. There was a period of 490 years when the kings, from Saul to the very last of the kings, where they didn't keep even one of the Shemitahs. And they did lots of other evil things too. At the end there, it was pretty terrible. But what God did was he used those Shemitahs, those 7-year periods, as the basis for their time in captivity. When the Babylonians took them, conquered Jerusalem and took them captive. So what he did was, for every Shemitah that they hadn't kept, there was 1 year in captivity for that. So that 490 years divided by 7 gives you 70 years. And so they were in captivity for 70 years. And God used the Shemitahs as a ruler to measure out what their penalty was going to be for not keeping these Sabbaths. And God even says that in these 70 years that you're going to be captive, the land is going to get the rest that it never got before, that you were supposed to give it. And so as bad as they were with the Shemitahs, they were worse with the Jubilees. They despised the whole idea of Jubilees. They couldn't get the idea of 2 years in a row of trusting God to provide for them. And it was so bad that they lost track of when those Jubilees were supposed to be. And so now we have no idea when a Jubilee is starting. All we know about this is that there's going to be a Yom Teruah in the future when Jesus is going to come. That's Yom Teruah is the day of blowing, or the day of trumpets. And there are a lot of people who believe that that day will also be the beginning of a Shemitah, and also the beginning of a Jubilee. So if we knew when the Jubilee cycle was, that would give us some information about when Jesus is going to come, but we don't know. And we're not even totally sure that it will be on a Jubilee and a Shemitah, but God tends to do things that way. So it would make a certain sense that it would be at the beginning of a Jubilee that he would do that. And I won't go into it, but there are some other reasons to believe that people think that it'll be at the beginning of a Jubilee. So it's unfortunate, but we have no idea when the Jubilee cycle begins. Now, there's a spiritual side to canceling debt that's important to understand, and this comes from Deuteronomy 15 as well. It wasn't just about canceling debt. It's about what's inside of you, and we've talked about that so many times before. from Deuteronomy, it says, the Bible says that a man who lends is not to consider the Shemitah cycle. So, um, and the man who borrows is not to consider it either. So if you know that there's a Shemitah coming up next year, then you aren't supposed to use that in any of your decisions about whether you're going to lend or borrow. And so an evil heart in a lender will say, I'm not going to make a 2-year loan if this Shemitah comes in 1 year. And God specifically says, don't have that heart. And an evil heart in a borrower will say, I'll ask for a 2-year loan because the Shemitah comes in 1 year and then I want to have to pay off only 1 year of it. And so though that's the kind of bad heart that God says he doesn't want. Don't think in those kind of terms. And just go about your normal life. And when the Shemitah comes, the loans are canceled, everything's fine, and I, God, will take care of you, he says. And so the commandment here to keep these the Shemitahs and the Jubilees was an opportunity to look inside of yourself and to see what's there. And that's always an important thing for us to check, is to ask those questions about how does this make me feel and what's inside of me that causes this. And so it really brings up the question of, are you a slave already? If you're having trouble lending to somebody when you know there's a Shemitah coming up, or you're planning to borrow because there's a Shemitah coming up, you're already a slave. You're already a slave to money and to debt. And so take a look at that, is what these things do, is they give you an opportunity to look at what you're at inside. And also the question comes up of, do you trust God to take care of you? If you cancel debt, if you allow the land to lie fallow and not harvest crops, are you really trusting God? Are you ready to trust God? So there's a deeper side to all of this, canceling debt and the land lying fallow. Okay, we're going to change topic just a little bit now. God's view of money, and then we're going to get into debt a little bit and some other things that are associated with that. And I brought up some verses here, particularly from Luke, but there's others like it, where you can see that God really doesn't think highly of wealth and money, and mammon it's sometimes called. So, and mammon is a bigger term than wealth. It more than likely refers to things that are also like abilities and skills, the things that you use to earn wealth. And so it's a bigger picture than just money. And from Luke 16:9 it says, also I say to you, make for yourselves friends of this money of evil, that whenever it has been spent, they may receive you into their eternal dwellings. And then it continues on a couple of verses later and says, if therefore you are not faithful with the wealth of evil, who will commit to you the reality? So he says, if you can't even handle the wealth of the evil mammon, money, if you can't handle that, who's going to give you anything bigger to deal with, to commit to you to be in charge of? And then in 16:13, 2 more verses later again, it says, there is no servant who can serve both masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will honor the one and he will neglect the other. You cannot serve God and money. And so what you see there is that God has a really poor view of wealth and money. And that's because he really doesn't want us to think in those terms. And he wishes that we wouldn't be able to, but we're in a society that just is like that, a world that's like that. And he doesn't care for it because he sees it so often as corrupting people. How many references in the Bible are there to how money can corrupt people? And also idolatry. It becomes a problem for people who are worshiping wealth, worshiping money, success, all of the things that come from that. So these are the reasons that God really doesn't think highly of wealth and wishes that we could be without it. But he recognizes the reality of that. And so he would prefer that we live in a society where no one is poor, where if someone has money and someone doesn't have money, then the person who has money will take the opportunity to give some money to the person who needs money and help him along, help him not to be poor anymore. That's the kind of society that God would like us to be in. But we aren't in that. It's just not reality. In fact, Jesus says the poor will always be with you. And so the reality in our world is that it's just not possible to have societies that work that way. The winner in such a society is the one who doesn't play the game of giving money to anybody, and he's the one who winds up with all of the money. So God recognizes that the kind of society he would like us to be in is just not possible at this time. And so what he did was he gave laws to us to make capitalism work. and to fix some of the flaws that are in capitalism. And we see those in the Shmita, and we'll talk about that too here. So, but first, capitalism is really what the Bible talks about as the fundamental idea, is that idea that he who works reaps the benefits of his work, and no one else takes from him what he's done. And and so the Bible supports that in so many other ways. But it never supports the idea of taking from those people that you think have too much and giving to those who have, you think, too little. And so that's a very Marxist idea. And Marx is said to quote, or this is said to be a quote from Marx, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. Now, what Marx isn't saying there is the government will take from the people that they think have greater abilities and more money and give to those people that the government thinks are in need. And you won't find that idea in the Bible. It just isn't there. And what God wants is people who freely give with a good heart. And we see that in lots of places in the Bible too. So he wants people to have that opportunity to show the goodness in them and show their love and express that by helping people who need help. And that's a very different thing. That's a giving idea rather than a taking idea. And it's so different that way because the giving is to your benefit. There are verses that talk about the lender is better off, more advantaged than the borrower because he gets this experience of an opportunity to share and be good. So, and I said that this is all tied into those Shmitas and Jubilees and weekly Sabbath as well, in that all of these things fix flaws in capitalism that make capitalism work. And we know that capitalism has those flaws. We have ups in the markets and we have downs in the markets, and we have people crashing and people going out of business and debt collapses and all things like that are failures in the capitalist system when it gets in the state where it is right now, where people are doing all sorts of crazy things that have never been done before. And so those flaws are things that just happen in a capitalist system. And we've created laws where we try to manage those to some extent. We try to keep companies from getting too big so that they don't take over everything. We have laws that control what people can do with money, certain things they can and can't do. And so we've tried to fix those flaws in our ways, but God has already set up fixes for these if we would just follow the fixes that he gave us. But we don't, of course. So the weekly Sabbath, the fix there is that it keeps us from becoming slaves to work. And so you don't get into this idea that you have to work all the time. Every day you need to work. And so the weekly Sabbath breaks that and breaks that slavery to work that goes along with that idea. And the Shemitah, as we've seen, keeps us from becoming slaves to debt or just slaves to men. And so by breaking both of those, you break that problem where a person can get in debt for the rest of their life and never be able to get out again. Or someone can be in slavery for the rest of their life and never be able to get out. And the Jubilee is similar to that. It keeps us from becoming slaves to property, because if you give away the property, you've shown that you aren't a slave to it. It's something that you control and not something that controls you. So we see that the Shemitah and the Jubilee are both opportunities to fix the natural flaws that are in a capitalist system and to make things better. Now we'll talk a little bit about economic effects of the Shemitah. What happens if you are actually keeping the Shemitah? And of course we don't in our society now, so we don't see these. But your natural reaction to this is that you would keep loan terms short. Nobody would get 20-year mortgages. That just wouldn't happen in that kind of a society like we do now. And so instead of that, you do short-term things, short-term finances, and you do things in smaller ways. And the result of that is there's no accumulation of debt. You don't wind up with people who owe more than they can ever hope to pay back. And we'll talk about that some more too. So in our current situation here, we have governments that are spending way beyond what they could ever hope to pay off. And they don't even care about paying it off, to be honest. And the result of that is that children and grandchildren are being born as slaves to debt. They are born with a price tag on their head, a debt that they will need to pay back at some point. And that's given by the people in our society now that are enslaving our children, unborn as yet, into debt. And that's just wrong. God doesn't want that kind of thing. And so with the effect of the Shemitah is that that would never happen. Debts are short term and they come to an end and they don't continue on to your children or grandchildren. And that's a big benefit of it. The Shemitah controls that. And the other thing that the Shemitah does is it encourages preparation and planning and patience, which are all good Christian Bible values that we should have. And they're very much against that microwave thinking of, I must have it now, that I want it, I get it. And that's not a godly thinking at all. So God wants us to prepare and plan and patience and exercise those things. And so with short-term debts, you have to do that. If you wanted to buy a house, you saved up to buy a house, or you built it yourself and used whatever money you had to pay for it. And so a very different society emerges when you've got these Shemitahs and the Jubilees too, controlling how you do things in your financial lives. And so with an economy that's not based on debt, you have an economy instead that's based on saving. And so people save for things in advance. They prepare and they plan, and they make better decisions because of that. There isn't that consumerism idea of I see it, I want it, it's pretty, I'll buy it. And so you start to think, you start to prepare and plan and think ahead how your money is going to be spent. And what you often discover when you do that is that by the time you've saved up enough money for the thing that you wanted, you realize that now there's something different that you should have had instead, and that the thing that you were going to buy and were saving up for is really not what you wanted. And so the short-term loans keep things more sensible because of that. And that's a value that we can put to our own lives too. If we save more and plan more, then that results in us borrowing less, and we don't pay the loans of pay the costs of such long loans, such big loans, and that results in more money in your jeans. And that's of course what we all want, more money in our jeans. So that society that God created based on the Shemitahs is a very different society than what we live in now. All of these problems that we currently have wouldn't exist in that society. And with debt comes a lie. And the lie is, I know the future. And you may not realize that you're making that lie when you make a long-term loan, but you don't know what your future is. You don't know if you're going to actually be able to pay back that loan. And so in the past, if a man died young or unexpectedly, or was badly injured so that he couldn't work, or was incapacitated in some way and just couldn't do anything to earn money for his family was responsible for his debts. Whatever money he had borrowed still needed to be paid back. And it fell on his family to do that. Now, we don't do things that way right now, but the Bible talks about that in Matthew 18:25. It says, since he was not able to pay, the master ordered that he and his wife and his children and all that they had be sold to repay the debt. And that did and could happen in those times. You and your whole family could be sold into as slaves in order to repay the debt that you had owed. Nowadays, we have a loan insurance, and so whoever's lending the money buys loan insurance and charges you for that loan insurance in the cost of the loan. And so that way the lender doesn't have to take it out on your family. The insurance company is going to pay for that. So he's covered in that way. So we do things differently in that way. But that just results in more costs to you, the borrower. And so the Shemitah rejects that lie. It says, you don't know the future. Don't take out long-term loans like that. You have no idea what the future brings. And also it kind of goes along with that you aren't that good at planning either. So the Shemitahs give you an opportunity to think things through for the period of time that you're borrowing money or thinking about borrowing money, and better planning leads to better decisions and a more prosperous future. So how can we apply some of these ideas to Christians? We don't live in a society that does the Shemitah or Jubilee or anything like that. I think good advice is, as much as possible, keep your debts small and short term, because you benefit from that. And also have the patience to save for things. Don't always be looking around for something to burn the money that's in your pocket, and looking for something that's advertised on TV and jumping up for that. We shouldn't be into consumerism to that level. We should have the patience to save things, the mentality of preparing for things, and planning for things. All of those things should be part of the way we think of life in this society, this world that we live in. Psalms 37:21 says something related here. It says, "The wicked borrow and do not repay, but the righteous give generously." And that should be us. We should be prepared to help anyone who needs the help that we can give them. If we can give them help, we may not be in a situation to do that. But when there is that opportunity, this is a blessing to us to be able to help others and not to expect to be repaid. Luke 6:30 says, "Give to everyone who asks you, and do not demand from him who takes what is yours." So a very different mentality should be ours. We should be prepared to help anyone who needs help that we can help. Essentially brothers mostly, but maybe not just brothers in the faith, maybe people outside of the faith too. But we live in a society that values none of these things. So we do this on our own and not because society is encouraging it in any way. And I mentioned earlier that farmers understand that sabbatical idea for the land. They know that every 7 years, they don't line it up with a Shmita, of course, but every 7 years, the land needs a year off. It needs a break. And nowadays, I believe they still do it. Last time I checked with anybody who was a farmer, they still cycle their land. They have, usually they have their land plots on different cycles. So there's only one plot of land they aren't doing anything with in 1 year, and all the others are still producing in that year. And so it's different from exactly what the Shmita was saying to do, but still it preserves the land. The land needs that break and gets that break by farmers. And now another branch off this whole topic area is God is still applying this Shmita now, even though people aren't keeping it. He still is. And we can see that because we can look at some of the things that have happened throughout history. And what people, investors particularly, have known for a long time is that in the fall season, this is a time when financial crashes happen. They don't understand exactly why, but they all go into the fall with trepidation, thinking, well, if something bad could happen, because bad things happen in the fall quite a bit. And if you understand this idea, the problem isn't that it's the fall season. It's a particular day on the calendar that keeps moving around in the fall. And so financial crashes have a very bad habit of occurring on Yom Teruah of a Shmita year. And so that day it's a fixed day on God's calendar. It's 1 Tishrei on God's calendar, but that can be anywhere from September 5 to October 5. This year is September 7th. And so this date can happen anytime in that fall period that financial crashes have been known to happen. And if you look back and actually change to God's calendar for a lot of the big crashes, you'll see that, yeah, everything tends to line up with that. There's definitely a strong correlation there. And so it never happens, this, I should say, Yom Teruah never happens on a Sabbath evening. It never happens on a Tuesday evening, and it never happens on a Thursday evening. That's just the way God's calendar works. And so those crashes always happen on the day that begins after those days, or not on those days, I should say. So looking back at just a little bit of history, it doesn't, I'm not saying that something bad happens every Shemitah year, because in 2014, nothing special happened there. There wasn't any particularly big crash that happened. But back in 2007, there was a really big crash. The Dow Jones lost 777 points in 1 day. I was shocked when I saw the stock ticker suddenly drop down all day. It dropped like a stone. And then when they cut off, as they do at the end of the day, they cut off trading. It stopped right at 777. I said, ooh, there's a message from God right there. And so what that did was it began what was called, or is now called, the global financial collapse. And here in Texas, we didn't really experience that because we hadn't gotten into the problem that caused that. And the problem that caused that was that a lot of loans were being given out to people who couldn't hope to pay them back. They were given terms that were easy at the start of the loan, that allowed them into the loan, but then the terms would change inside of the loan, and they couldn't afford it. And so it was breaking a lot of people. And so God, it seems, has stepped in to break that. But Texas wasn't doing that. Texas law didn't allow those kind of loans to be done. And so we in Texas really didn't suffer much from that financial collapse. But a lot of other people did. Banks in other states, big banks suffered hard. Some of them went out of business. And all around the globe, it was affected because of this whole financial system being tied together what happens to the U.S. Reflects on everybody. So there have been Shmitas where really big crashes have happened, and characteristically the biggest ones tend to happen on these Shemitah years, and on this particular Yom Teruah day that begins the Shemitah year. So I don't know if that's going to happen this year. When you look at our economy right now and what we're doing with debt, it's easy to believe that something big could happen, but it's God will decide what he's going to do when he's going to do it. But just keep that in mind. Okay, we're going to change topic again a little bit. I warned you in advance that we were going to be doing this, but this is still tied together. So Yom Teruah is still where we're talking about. We're going to expand that now into talking a little bit about all of the fall feast events that are about to begin. I'm a few weeks ahead of time here, but this is the way it needed to be. So the fall feasts begin with Yom Teruah, which I mentioned is the day of blowing or the day of trumpets. And that represents the return of the king. That day is sometimes called Return of the King. And even by Jews. The Jews understand a lot about the fall feast, a surprising amount. I don't know where they got it from. The Bible doesn't really say what those days are about, but they figured it out for themselves somehow, or maybe by God's revelation, I don't know. But they understand a lot of what I'm about to explain to you here. And this is stuff that I've explained before, so it's kind of a review for many of you. So on this Yom Teruah in the future, we don't know which Yom Teruah it's going to be. Jesus returns, and Thessalonians says that he returns and stays up in the clouds, up in the sky, and that we are the dead are resurrected, the faithful dead are resurrected, and we are translated into new bodies, and together we all go up to meet him in the clouds, is what it says. And so it begins by him being in the clouds, and so that's that Yom Teruah, that one day, the day of the trumpet announcing the return of the king. And then there's a period that is called the days of awe. Even the Jews call it the days of awe, but the Bible doesn't call it that. The Jews have figured it out, and we have figured it out too, is that this is a last chance at salvation. There's a 10-day period here where Jesus and all of the faithful are up in the clouds, and there's a 10-day last chance at salvation opportunity. It's a period of judgment. You can see that judging is going on, decisions are being thought through, and that decision process is going on. And so that 10-day period there is that last chance at salvation. And after that, the day after that 10-day period is Yom Kippur, which is the Day of Atonement. And so on that year, this is going to be the day of final atonement. And we talked about this in the last lesson, the Ezekiel lesson, that after this final atonement, no more atonement is possible for that. And we'll get to those verses about the virgins and their oil in just a moment here. So on this Day of Atonement, this becomes the last day of atonement. From then on, Jesus' sacrifice no longer atones for anything, only and comes to an end there. So what we believe happens is that Jesus comes to earth either on this day or on the Feast of Ingathering that comes 5 days later, or maybe somewhere in between there. But it makes some sense that he would come on the Day of Atonement to do that final atonement at that time. And so that's the Day of Atonement. And 5 days later comes what's called the Feast of Ingathering, the Feast of Getting Together. And Sukkot, which is the Feast of Booths, which is also the same idea of God being with his people while his people are in booths. And so what this symbolizes is Jesus being on earth with his people and being together with his people. So you see in the fall feast that whole resurrection, rapture that happens when Jesus comes, the 10-day period, last chance at salvation, the Day of Atonement, that atonement is the final atonement for everything. After that, atonement isn't available anymore. And then the 5 days comes the Feast of Ingathering, where we're together with Jesus on the earth. And the last thing I want to cover here is how that is related in those verses about the virgins that we talked about in the last lesson and their oil. And so I'll bring back those verses here again and bring out something new that you might not have noticed before. So the verses say, this is Matthew 25, 6 through 12. In the middle of the night, there was an outcry. Behold, the groom has come. Go out to meet him. Then all those virgins arose and trimmed their lamps. The fools said to the wise, give us some of your oil. Behold, our lamps have gone out. But the wise answered and said, why? There is not enough for us and for you. Go to those who sell and buy for yourselves. And when they went to buy, the groom came, and those who were ready entered with him into the wedding place, and the door was barred. Now, we talked about the door being barred and what that means. And we see now that that lines up exactly with the Day of Atonement. After that, there is no more atonement that's possible. So the people who have gone to be with Jesus, he's atoned for them, and now atonement is no longer possible. But there's other things to notice in here. It said, I've got marked in yellow there, it says the groom has come, and then later on in yellow again, it says the groom came. So it looks like he's arrived twice. How did he come once and then he came again? Well, part of the answer to that is exactly from the fall feasts, because they line up exactly with this. So the groom has come, go out to meet him. Go out to meet him is a way of saying, is talking about that rapture, the resurrection from the dead, and everybody going to meet him in the clouds, okay? And so then it says the virgins had gone out to get oil for themselves, and then the groom came. And that's talking about when Jesus comes to earth, the Day of Atonement, most likely. And at that time, when the groom comes, then the final atonement is done and the door is barred. So in a sense, the groom does arrive twice, first in the air, and this is talked about in Thessalonians as well. And second coming is on the earth. Now, those are only separated by 10 days. But after that second coming, there's no more atonement after that. And that's, we talked about why there's a need for a temple complex in the millennium that follows right after that. So there's quite a bit of information I've poured into that. I hope you've been able to pick out some good pieces of that. And we'll have a new topic next week, I guess. Any questions or thoughts?
Maybe a comment. Going back to the Shmita, thank you very much for that presentation, that Bible study, Stan. I love this subject. I think it's fascinating. But it looks like, there's nothing new under the sun, right? Like the Bible states. Again, the Shmita, it says, be a good borrower, be a good lender,
Mm-hmm.
But I'm sure there were some people that didn't pass that test, right?
Yeah,
Didn't,
certainly.
Just like today, right? Same thing,
Yeah.
Same scenario, pretty much.
Yeah, people don't change.
I know so many Christians, good Christians, that they have a good heart, and for the most part they try to do good, but when it comes to that, either their finances or even when it comes to asking people to always help,
Mm-hmm.
and they only call people when they need help. They never call them when they want to just say hello, how are you, blessings. They only call people when they want something. That's when they ask you about their children, your parents, your health, oh, blessings and blessings. But it's kind of like that, kind of like the Judas kiss, kind of. It's really, really sad. But so many people nowadays just fail miserably at that.
Yeah,
You know,
it's true.
it's horrible. But thank you so much for that Bible study. It's amazing. It's fascinating, really.
Yeah, and that's definitely a truism. People fail, and Christians fail as well. Some in one way, some in another way. Um, I wish it wasn't that way, but it is. There are people who are not mature Christians, even though they are mature physically, and there are people who are more mature and they're younger. It just is that way.